Hello and welcome to a virtual water cooler chat brought to you by the Ecological Society of America. My name is Jessica Johnston. I'm an education program coordinator, and we're going to be talking about managing and conserving plants and biodiversity in plant biodiversity in the 21st century. I have three great guest hosts with me today, and I will introduce them in just a second. They all participated in a program that I have the privilege of administrating, and it's called the Scientists in Parks program, where students get to do an internship at a national park for the summer. So we'll let them talk about their experience, and we'll go into deeper conversation about plant conservation. But first, let's go over a few housekeeping rules. The water cooler chat, if this is your first time here, is a really informal discussion. And the idea is that we're bouncing ideas off of each other. So all experiences are welcome and encouraged. In fact, we would love for you to have a conversation with the guest hosts. We just ask that you remain muted and raise your digital hand if you want to unmute yourself. Once we call upon you, you're welcome to unmute. We also encourage simultaneous conversation. So you can definitely put your thoughts in the chat box, share any resources along the way. We love that. We'll actually save it for later, and we'll put it on our ESA water cooler page. I just want to let everybody know that we are recording this event today. So if you don't want your name or your video on, we understand, although we always like to see it. We're going to put a live transcription on. Okay. So Jessie, who is also a program coordinator with ESA, do you mind just telling us about the upcoming education events?
Yes, so we're launching our second ever cohort of Ecology Plus mentorship program. It's for undergraduates, graduates, and early career scientists. You have to reside within the DC metropolitan area, but it's a way to get a mentor that's outside of academia. So if you're interested in nonprofits, government, policy, this would be an excellent opportunity to explore that, those different fields. And I'll drop where you can access the website in the chat right now.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessie. I tried to explain that last week and I didn't do such a great job, so I appreciate your help there. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to get right into who our guest hosts are for today, starting with Vida Svanstrom. Vida just started her master's degree in plant and fungal taxonomy, diversity and conservation at the Royal Botanical Gardens in Kew, London. So thank you for staying up late for us, Vida. And Vida, this past summer, worked at the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historic Park, located in Maryland, right where I am. And she worked on developing a species-specific management strategy for endangered plants. So thank you for coming, Vida. Also, we have Hannah Bonner. She's a PhD student at the University of Colorado, studying the amount of water available in seasonal snowpacks. Seasonal snowpacks. So she does snow, she does water. So why is she here on a plant conversation? Well, this past summer, she shifted to looking at benthic cyanobacteria toxins in the tributaries of the Virgin River at the National Park, Zion National Park. And finally, we have Sienna Wessel, who is also pursuing a master's degree in botany at the University of Wyoming. And her research is focused on understanding the responses of imperiled sagebrush steppe communities to restoration efforts and incorporating ecological theory to improve restoration outcomes in the face of climate change. So this past summer, Sienna was very fortunate to work on sagebrush steppe as an SIP intern at Grand Teton National Park, where she helped ecological research in management actions, update monitoring plans, and communicate to the public about the importance of sagebrush steppe. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing screen because I have a hard time saying that, sagebrush steppe. And I'm going to kick it over to our guest host. And I think we're going to start with Vida. You want to talk a little bit more about your experience?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Jessica.
No problem.
Also, it's great to see there's other international people here in the chat, not just Americans. So yeah, like Jessica said, my name is Vida Svanstrom, and I just graduated from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland with a bachelor's degree in evolutionary biology, and now I'm studying towards a master's degree in plant and fungal taxonomy, diversity, and conservation at Kew Gardens in London. My undergraduate and now my graduate research has focused on understanding extinction risk in plants, especially looking at applied research focused on accelerating the production of extinction risk assessments on the IUCN Red List, focusing on the use of automation and machine learning. But despite this rather specific focus for my research, I am really just passionate about plant biodiversity, conservation, and management more broadly. And again, like Jessica said, for my Scientists in Parks Fellowship this summer, I was at the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park in Maryland. If you don't know, the park is particularly rich in rare plant species. 189 state-listed species, to be exact, have been recorded in the park, and most of them are facing diverse and serious threats related to things like recreation, invasive species, climate change, to name just a few. And park staff have implemented really extensive monitoring programs and surveying programs for these rare species in recent years. So I got to use this geodata coupled with literature reviews and fieldwork in the park in order to identify priority species for specific management activities. And then I also was able to create detailed management strategies for high priority species. I was also responsible for creating propagation protocols and for suggesting species for an upcoming population augmentation project. So that will see rare plants propagated at a botanic garden and then return to the park in order to improve population sizes and resilience. So very much a species specific focus for me this summer. And by the end of my fellowship, I ended up writing individual management recommendations for about 20 rare plants in the park. And I also had the chance to contribute to lots of rare plant surveys, which was lots of fun throughout the summer. So that's me.
Awesome. Thanks, Vida. I'm Hannah Bonner, and Jessica already ousted me as a geologist, so I admit it, it's true. But luckily, my research, I'm a PhD candidate at University of Colorado Boulder, is really focused on using monitoring and fieldwork to make informed management decisions. And whether that has to do with water, or in the case of Zion National Park, toxigenic cyanobacteria species, I do think it is relevant to our discussion today. My research also was focused quite a bit on science communication and efficiently and effectively communicating complicated scientific information to the public to, again, inform good management decisions. As Jessica mentioned, and I mentioned earlier, I spent the summer in Zion National Park, where just in summer of 2020, they found cyanotoxins in the Virgin River, which at the time was only the second instance of cyanotoxins being found in a United States river system. And as you can imagine, is very concerning. These cyanotoxins can cause permanent illness and in high enough doses, even death. And so the park has really been grappling, figuring out how to manage these species when they have a visitation potentially exceeding 5 million people this past year. And so I got to spend the summer trying to understand these species better. They've been pretty little research has been done on them until recently, and then also figuring out a way to monitor their spread through the Virgin River and the amount of toxins that were being found in the water, and then translating that into a way to manage visitor nature interactions and to really mitigate risk, and also to communicate what we were finding and the associated risk with local decision makers and with all these public people coming to visit the park. So very excited to talk with you today, to share these experiences and to come up with some new ideas.
Awesome, hard to follow up. Great intros. Well, hi everyone, I'm Sienna Wessel. I'm a master's student at the University of Wyoming. And as Jessica said, a lot of my focus is really at the community level, thinking about drivers and patterns of community change in imperiled plant communities, which includes the sagebrush steppe, as it's been reduced to about 50% of the range it once covered in the United States West. And so in particular in Grand Teton National Park, there's an area that was hayed in the late 1800s for sustenance for Mormon settlers. And now the park is looking to restore that area. It's a critical area for sage grouse habitat, migrating mule deer, pronghorn, a lot of other animal diversity as well. And so I'm really interested in how ecological theory can inform management actions and help us to understand why restoration tends to be so unpredictable, get a better grasp on what actions lead to higher success. And so I was able to continue that work this summer with Grand Teton National Park, but I sort of looked at some different perspectives. So I both used some new collected data to quantify restoration success and help inform management strategies and monitoring strategies as well. But I also gained a new, very relevant skill set to the management of plant biodiversity in the form of multiple science communication projects that ranged from engaging the public directly through field days to discussions with working groups through the National Park Service on at-risk species, to developing kind of a research brief white paper that translated complex restoration science into management relevant recommendations. And so I've really come to understand the great importance of communication skills when it comes to conservation, especially when you're a scientist, to be able to translate that and reach out to managers, or if you're yourself a manager, to facilitate those connections and those conversations is so critical to the actual implementation of science on the ground. So I was really excited to get to have those experiences. And through all of that work, it became very clear to me that the management of and conservation of plant biodiversity is just becoming increasingly necessary while simultaneously more challenging, right? So pressures of the Anthropocene combined with fiscal and logistic limitations ultimately force us to make really difficult choices, difficult but imperative choices and management decisions. And so today as a group, we're hoping to inspire some discussion about innovative approaches to tackle all of those challenges, and also to think about whether students and future plant managers are acquiring the necessary skill sets and receiving information about these cutting edge techniques. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Vida to kick off that conversation.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'll start out with a question. So the year 2021 marked the beginning of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which acknowledges the exceptionally urgent need to reverse global ecosystem degradation. In recent years, it's also been estimated that over 500 plant species have gone extinct since the 1700s, and that 40% of plant species that are extant are currently at risk of extinction. So how has your agenda for plant biodiversity research and management shifted over the past few years in response to these challenges? And what do you think are the most promising new techniques, approaches, agendas, which are relevant to plant biodiversity management? Does anyone want to have a first go?
Well, Vida, I had a question for you, actually, maybe since you're sort of more of a species level botanist, and I'm also really interested in kind of expanding my reach to the population level. Have you, in your experience and your knowledge of kind of species risk management and that level, have you seen a lot of like population models and demographic models actually being used to directly inform those kind of estimates of species risk, or to help managers identify which plant species they really need to target most? Or are like, what has kind of been the basis for those risk assessments that you've seen?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a lot of work on estimating extinction risk right now is focusing on getting as many species assessed as possible in a short amount of time as possible, because it is estimated that 40% of plant species are at risk of extinction, but we don't know exactly which species those are. So a lot of focus has been on using kind of the easiest way possible, which for plants is usually looking at their range size. You can often predict if a plant's at risk of extinction just looking at its range size. But increasingly, models looking at things like how populations are expected to change due to climate change are being used. And some studies have actually found that using these kind of models shows higher, or makes a species more likely to be shown as at risk of extinction. So personally, I think that integrating these models is really important, because we can see that we can show that more plants are at risk of extinction than if we just use simple methods like looking at range size. So yeah, I think modeling is important in every aspect of plant biodiversity research, including what I do on extinction risk assessments.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
I was also going to say another technique that I'm particularly interested in, I don't know too much about, but the use of remote sensing in management and conservation. Like I've been reading some studies lately about the amazing things that we can detect with remote sensing nowadays. Things like, I mean, we're even getting to the point where we can see specific tree species ID from remote sensing. You can use LiDAR to find soil types and leaf functional traits and things like that. And I know a lot of examples of this being used at the theoretical level. I don't know any examples of it being used at a management level, but I'd be interested to know if they have been applied and in what way.
Awesome point.
Looks like you got a little bit of a shy group today. Anybody who wants to answer the question, you're welcome to put it in the chat, or if you can unmute for whatever reason, we can pivot off of that too.
And I will just add, going off what you just said, Vita, a lot of my research has been looking at water availability from snow, much of which accumulates in forested areas. And so actually like a big revolution that's occurring right now in snow modeling is using remote sensing of forested areas to actually characterize tree characteristics, which improves then model representation of snow accumulation and snow behavior. So I'm sure this applies much more broadly in the plant world. But I think that's a cool example of how that remote sensing data of plants is also being used to predict water and make management decisions related to that.
That's
so
cool.
Is that for applied management or is that for more fundamental studies? I'm just curious.
I mean, both. Like those values are used when it comes to figuring out water allocations and, you know, how much water to keep in a reservoir. So definitely both cases.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, there's definitely like, I'm sure that's absolutely reciprocal to like, you know, the projection of the snowpack is also, you know, going to be driving the plant community as well. So that's pretty cool that it's kind of cycle with the remote sensing. I think one thing, so I pulled Twitterverse before we had this talk because I just like wanted to get broader ideas of what people thought were like sort of causing barriers between modeling and applied management on the ground. And one thing that really came up is just like this lack of transfer of knowledge from the science level to applied management, which we all are probably pretty aware of. But somebody kind of brought up this cool point that, you know, maybe as scientists, those of us who want to identify that way more than maybe management, could be reaching out directly to some groups that would benefit from the knowledge of our research and like getting those papers out behind paywalls. And I was kind of curious what people thought about, like, have you heard of coalitions doing that, or groups that, or is it just sort of a one-on-one, like you do your best and try and get your papers to who it matters to when you can?
I haven't published any, or I don't have a big publishing history behind me yet, but I often think about whether it would be useful to translate scientific results in ways other than publishing papers. Like publishing papers is a good way to get it out to other scientists, but I'm uncertain the amount that land managers are able to keep up with the theory because it's just so overwhelmingly huge. And I don't know what good answers there are for that, but I think it's important to consider that not everyone can access, you know, the publication world the same way as scientists can.
Hi, so I just put my intro into the chat. My name is Maisie Carr, and we actually, so I work with the EPA Office of Water with the National Wetland Condition Assessment. And this is something that we struggle with a lot, is getting our data out to people who care about it and making it accessible, because we have like this huge data set. Like we sample over 1,000 sites every 5 years. So there's a ton of data out there, and some of it is on private land, and like lots of different things can be done with it. And some of the things that we have explored are data dashboards, and with Esri being a huge thing now, maps are awesome ways to show your data and get people involved in understanding what's going on, because that's another thing, is getting people to understand a lot of the technical language and concepts. So we're actually exploring these things as well, trying to get people engaged with our data. And these are just a few things that we came up with. Because we don't put our data behind paywalls because we're a federal agency. So that's like pretty unethical and things like that. So just a few ideas that we have explored.
I'm Richard Gulliver. I'm based in the United Kingdom, but I'd like to put in a good word for the American journal, Natural Areas Journal, produced by the Natural Areas Association. Virtually all the papers that are produced are on some aspect of the interface between scientific work and management. And another nice thing about the journal is that it covers both animal papers and plant materials and topics like pollination, where the two interrelate. I expect many of you know about it, but I was quite late in coming to learn about it, so I thought I'd mention it now.
Thank you for sharing. I didn't know about either of those things, so that's very enlightening.
Yeah, neither did I.
And I'm excited to check both out.
I was just noticing in the chat, Janet had mentioned talking about how, you know, people outside the sciences are pretty overwhelmed by the concept of reading a big scientific paper. Janet, you mentioned these like data dashboards. Would you be willing to elaborate a little bit more on that? Sounds like a really interesting concept.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not really in a good place right now to be visible or or speak out loud, which is why I just put it in the chat. I just, because the other speaker from EPA, Macy, also mentioned I think data dashboards, and I just happened to be involved in a project where some of my collaborators have developed a data dashboard, and it's just what she said, right? It's a way to serve up data to the public or to target a particular group, you know, or to make what's probably public data more accessible and in a form that can be useful to a group of land managers or conservation managers or something like that. So the example that I'm familiar with is working on a project in Southern California where to support resilient restoration, ecological restoration under climate change by tribal communities, one of our collaborators is putting together a data dashboard, which is basically map-based, right? Which serves up a lot of, you know, gathers together map data that might be useful for the region, for land managers and conservation managers in and restoration projects that might, you know, things about fire frequency as well as predicted climate change and things like that.
That sounds so cool. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see Suzanne, you've got your hand. I'd love to hear your comment.
Hey, everybody. I'm Suzanne Copter, and I wanted to say that the Natural Areas Journal is a wonderful journal, but if you ever have the chance to go to a meeting of the Natural Areas Association, those are the most fun meetings I have ever been to. And I'm a botanist and ecologist, and I've been to various places, so I recommend that. But the comment I wanted to make was that it is really important to publish scientific papers. But even before you do that, a lot of you on the panel are relatively early in your career. You can have a big impact by writing letters to newspapers. I know that's kind of an old-fashioned means of communication, but a lot of people read them in print and online. And I've tried to write about every few months, something about endangered habitats in Florida, different measures. And the other thing I wanted to add is, the habitats you've been working in Sienna and others are so big and vast compared to the habitat I work the most in South Florida, which is pine rockland. That is the area that's highest and driest where everybody wanted to live and build. And just preserving what's left is so important. And I hadn't realized earlier in my career how important it was to help establish reserves for that land, whether they're private or governmental, because more and more it gets built on all the time living in South Florida where there's a lot of tourism and things like that. And I have to say, this wild music is, I'm at an amusement park in North Carolina with my family, and I didn't pipe in till now because I had to take a picture of them going by on a little choo-choo train. But anyway, keep up the good work, everybody. I'm glad to be listening to you.
Thanks for joining us, Suzanne, from your
Thanks.
vacation.
It's so good to see you, Dr. Copter. Thanks for your comment.
Yeah, I also worked this summer in an area that has a lot of development. I'm from Florida too, love the Pine Rocklands, but I worked in Maryland this summer, and a lot of habitats there are also really fragmented and really small areas left. And I think that they present very different problems to, or maybe not different, but in some ways different problems than areas like Sienna works in out west. And I think it's interesting the different approaches you have to take for managing really small fragmented areas compared to restoring really large areas like out west.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting comment. And I've actually thought about this a little bit too, that it seems, and I could be wrong, but there's sort of a trend towards more species focused assessments and protection kind of on the east, whereas in the west, we have these massive tracts of land that I think maybe it's not as feasible in some cases, unfortunately, to be tracking the rare species that we do have, even though they are fewer than what you see in the east with development. And that's something I've thought about a lot, is like how we could increase the resources available to Western rare plant protection. Even though there aren't as many rare species, we still have several that are sort of flying under the radar. And I don't have a good answer for that, but you bringing that up made me think of that.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a combination of there are more locally rare species probably in the east and the west, and also it's just easier, like in C&O Canal, it's feasible to, for a lot of these rare species, know all the populations of them in the park, know how big the populations are. I mean, it's still a lot of work. The park staff at C&O Canal put a lot of work into making sure we know how the different populations are doing, but I would imagine that it would be much, much more difficult to do that kind of monitoring in Grand Teton or Zion.
I think that comment really transitions us into maybe a bit of a discussion about monitoring as well. And whether you're monitoring a small area or a large area, I would love to hear from the group if there's certain monitoring techniques or approaches or strategies that you've employed recently that you found to be really effective or helpful or challenging. Any thoughts on recent monitoring strategies you've used that you'd like to share or think might be insightful for us?
Hi, it's Macy again. Just speaking from kind of a push that I'm seeing in the sphere of our water monitoring branch. We're really pushing into citizen science, or we use all different terms for it, but citizen science or community science and things like that. And I think it's especially useful in the age that we are with technology in the application of plants, because with things like iNaturalist and Seek and things like that, we can easily snap pictures of plants to like record them, and you have a geotag on them and things like that. We also have like several apps, which is another thing that I was going to mention as far as like sharing our data and our research is we're also experimenting with like our Shiny apps and things like that, where you don't have to have R or have to be a user of R, but you can still explore data through tools like that. But the citizen science has been a huge way that we've been exploring as far as monitoring in EPA and other organizations.
Thank you for sharing, Macy. Suzanne, I see your hand as well. Oh, maybe not right this minute.
Maybe she went back on the train ride or something. Suzanne, if you hear this later, we'd love to hear your thoughts. I really appreciated that, Macy. And I know something I thought a lot about this summer is, so with this toxigenic cyanobacteria in the Virgin River, there wasn't any precedence in the National Park Service of monitoring this. And so in establishing a monitoring system, really thinking a lot about, what is the end goal of our monitoring and how to prioritize and arrange and come up with a monitoring system that would really focus on the results and the information that we cared the most about. And I think, that's still something the park is trying to develop and figure out. But I'm curious too, if anyone has figured out a good method or strategy, as we're thinking about plants that might be newly endangered or, these new concerns, how do you decide what to prioritize in your monitoring strategies? And is there like a certain pattern or step-by-step process you follow in coming up with new monitoring systems?
Can I chime in? Sorry about
Absolutely.
that. I wanted to say that one of the monitoring things that my students and I have done in a lot of different places is looking for pollinators and insects on plants, because that's a measure of ecosystem health. Plus, that's what we're interested in research-wise. And there are different standardized methods for catching insects with bowls of soapy water, all sorts of things like that that you might not think of. I know. Sorry, are you ready? Okay, I'll be done in a minute. So that's what I wanted to add.
Love that. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. And I don't know if this is possible, but anyone who's listening, even if you would just put in the chat, maybe something interesting that you're monitoring right now, I think it'd be so fascinating to see of this 33 people of very diverse people, different things related to plants that are being monitored, whether it's pollinators or something else. So if you'd be willing just to type in the chat, I promise I won't call on you. It would just be cool to see a list of all the different things being monitored just in today's group.
Yeah, I thought I just mentioned about pollinators. I haven't done any pollinator monitoring specifically, but I often find it interesting that pollinator monitoring has much less focus on species identity than, for example, plant monitoring, because it is so difficult to identify the species. And personally, I think that's something that we could really improve on, is training more entomologists to be able to identify things like bees, because so much of what we know about pollinators is from things like bumblebees, or generalized to, broad groups. And I think in plants, if we had to make such broad generalizations, we have a lot different conclusions than from being able to focus on species specific things. So I don't know.
I was gonna say, there's a few good folks here, at least that I know at UW, and just through some associations that are definitely doing high resolution pollinator monitoring. But yeah, I agree that probably maybe in management cases, a lot of times as well, there's maybe some grouping to those higher taxonomic levels that doesn't quite capture what we might need to know, especially if you are thinking about the plant's perspective and the impact that it's having on, the reproduction biology. One thing I was going to say about monitoring that I've encountered is that, as many of you probably know, it's really common for monitoring programs to change focus over time, but B, also kind of start without a very concrete or solid goal. And I think that is a big area we could potentially improve upon, both as scientists and managers from both perspectives, by employing theory and also just kind of programmatically asking ourselves more deeply what it is that we need to know to conserve biodiversity. And so a lot of what I think about is what indicators of restoration success or of biodiversity really matter most. And I think there's not one tried and true answer, but that is something that can really affect your management strategy and your monitoring strategy as well.
Andrew, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I have just a question. I'm not a plant person, but when we're talking about pollinator monitoring, is there any if you want to, can you identify pollens? Because if you like grab a bee or you have a beehive, assuming that the pollen grains are relatively identifiable, you essentially have all these bees who are just constantly going out and sampling flowering plants. And I mean, if the plant's not flowering, the ones that you care about, that might be bad, but it could maybe be a really easy way to get an assessment of flowering plant diversity in the area. Is that like a thing?
I haven't heard of folks using it to assess flowering diversity in the area. Not that I know, maybe some people have, but I have heard about like, pollen transfer and the effect that that might have on like hybridization and also population dynamics as an area of research for conservation.
I could be wrong about this, but I think that I think there are studies that collect pollen like you suggested, Andrew, and maybe based on like DNA, like kind of like an eDNA approach, looking at species identity of pollen that way, because I think it would be really hard to identify plant species by pollen based on morphology, except for maybe orchids, because I don't know, I like orchids and they're much easier to they have very specific pollen, but most other species I think it'd be really difficult, but I think maybe an eDNA approach could do something like that.
Sarah says that they have a grad student using pollen DNA from bees to look at the community that they're collecting from and then relating that to the measured vegetation. Very cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Really cool research. Yeah, electron microscope pictures of pollen are very cool. They are very cool. And Macy says floral anatomy could be limiting flowers that might be ID'd from a hive. Well, sounds like we're ready for another question, maybe, unless anyone else has anything to add there. All right, so I've kind of hinted at this already, and this is a really, really broad question, so bear with me. But one thing that I've been thinking a lot about are what really are the biggest roadblocks that we're encountering in adapting management and also research programs to climate change and the extinction crisis. And I know there's a lot of multifaceted ways that this is taking hold, but really identifying like at the core of it, what is it that we need to be adapting our programs to really anticipate these changes in multiple areas of research in plant biodiversity?
I was wondering if any of you guys have heard of the resist, let me see if I can remember it, resist, accept, direct framework the National Park Service has proposed. It's looking at 3 different strategies. Yeah, rad. 3 different strategies for, managing natural resources in the face of climate change. You can, resist climate change and try to direct I don't remember exactly how it works, but you can resist, you can accept, or you can direct your natural resources in the face of climate change. I think it's really interesting specifically for national parks because, I mean, this isn't specific to plants, but like there's some natural resources that are so iconic and important for educating the community that it might be worth resisting a move away from, certain forests might not be the climactic optimum anymore, but they might be worth resisting climate change because they're so important, whereas in some cases accepting climate change or even directing towards a specific new resource. I don't know, I think it's an interesting framework for specifically looking at national parks and natural resources. I'm sorry, I can't be more eloquent about it. I don't remember exactly.
No, that was great. I totally got the picture of that. And actually, I realized in the midst of you saying that I have read that I have read this document. And yeah, I think that's right. Like setting boundaries and maybe like determining thresholds which drive your management actions a priori, like with the knowledge of generally how we expect climate. I mean, we don't know, it is regionally, dependent, right? And we know that in some areas variation is going to increase, in some areas extremes are going to increase, et cetera. So relying on climate modeling, right, is one thing, but then also developing these sort of goalposts, thresholds, and management pipelines of direction that result from, if A happens, then we can choose from B, C, or D kind of thing. Yeah. So having a framework, and that's a very management, right? Like that's something that has to come on the management level, on the management side. So that's interesting. And maybe that's something that scientists could be doing more, is like talking with managers about what those strategies are, reading these strategies and thinking about how their science could be informing those frameworks specifically. How about you, Hannah? Did you have considerations so you're monitoring, these cyanobacterial blooms that weren't previously monitored, this sort of new issue that they're getting hold of. It's already a challenge to deal with. And on top of that, I'm assuming that climate change would also be impacting that. So did you have considerations for that when you were, first thinking about monitoring and developing these strategies?
That's a great question. Yeah, for anyone who's not familiar with this benthic cyanobacteria species in Zion, perhaps one of the reasons they hadn't been detected or a problem previously is that 2020, when there was the really high levels of toxins, was the third year in a row when the park had not experienced its typical monsoon rains. So usually the Virgin River is flushed out every late summer and fall by these huge floods. But 2020 was the third year in a row when just the rains had not come, likely as a result of climate change and changing weather patterns, which allowed these toxigenic species to really flourish and toxin levels to reach very dangerous levels. And so luckily this past year, the monsoon did come back, and accordingly, measurements taken this fall are showing no detection of toxins, which is a relief. But certainly when it comes to ongoing monitoring and ongoing planning, climate change is going to factor in, because it's very likely that 2020 is not going to be the only year we have drought, but that likely disrupted weather patterns, disrupted monsoons will be an ongoing thing, and thus introduce continued concerns about these species. And so, yeah, I think, like you said, one of the challenges though is we don't know for sure what climate change is going to look like, or how it's going to play out, and how these patterns will be disrupted. So I think it also requires multiple facets of planning and being prepared for a lot of different outcomes that we can't be certain about. Which I guess looking at the chat is what people, yeah, Tegan was saying that exact same thing. It's challenging to know where to best direct those efforts.
I'm just curious, Hannah, if the fact that there wasn't a lot of blooms this year, that, the monsoon did come, did it mess up your monitoring plans for the summer, or?
Yes. So, we were concerned there wouldn't be a monsoon again, and we were seeing these species, they grow in these benthic mats. So we were seeing their spread increasing and toxin levels were ramping up, kind of in a mirror of 2020. And then, yeah, when the flood events started, we had floods as dramatic as flow going from about 25 CFS to over 2000 CFS in a matter of hours. And so we have some of our monitoring includes these bags that are deployed in the river. So they were clearly like destroyed by these floods. And it made it really hard to take samples as well, because the water gets really turbid, very full of sediment. So you couldn't even tell if there was cyanobacteria still growing. It was really hard to take samples in good places because you couldn't see anything. So yeah, that's was one of the challenges, is the things that probably help the species also really impede our monitoring efforts.
Yeah, and you weren't the only SIP intern this summer whose project was impacted by climate change. I know one of the other participants at, was it Lassen Volcanic Park, that they had big fires there, and she actually had to leave her internship, which was, we all felt very bad for her.
She got relocated to Crater Lake, right?
Yeah, so not too bad.
But yeah, and actually that's something that I thought about too. I definitely didn't have anything nearly as drastic going on in Grand Teton, but we did see that our phenology was very different this season than it was last season, because I was there last year as well. And that really impacted things, and it brought up these discussions about how climate change is going to impact not just the biodiversity and the things we're trying to protect, but also our monitoring, right? So we realized that what happened is, over the last decade or so, the phenology had shifted just enough that the window of monitoring time is really not appropriate anymore. But if you shift that monitoring time, then your data may not be comparable year to year in quite the same way. And so I started thinking about how many projects are going to face this issue, this barrier, and how we're going to adapt that. And I think that is something that's going to majorly affect management, because many managers do implement monitoring. And so I don't know if anybody else is thinking about that or dealing with that. There are certainly ways you can deal with that from a data perspective, but it is a unique challenge we're going to face.
Where you might have to rely on some of those neon data sets where they're doing the year-round monitoring, and eliminate the whole phenology conundrum, because you have the data all the time through all the seasons.
Yeah, but I wonder at the site level though, if you're doing it for a specific habitat or species, that could be really problematic.
This makes me think too, I'm really grateful that participants are a good mix between people who are still pursuing their studies, and then also some seasoned career veterans. And I know I've been thinking a lot about, how to take my education and approach my early years in my career to prepare me for this really changing world. And I think a lot of things that we've done for a long time historically, and have been the way things have always been done, aren't working anymore, like we've discussed. And it's really requiring us to change our mindset and change our approaches. And I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on how, we as perhaps young career people are still students, any recommendations or advice on preparing ourselves to best be able to handle this changing scientific world and this changing world.
I could chime in for just a second. I would say that at least from the people I've talked to that are my predecessors, they didn't have these problems when they were coming up. They weren't really critically thinking about global climate change. They were wandering in the woods and having a great time just staring at snails and whatever, and then creating research papers and developing life history information, right? And so we have these large, complex modeling issues. And I think that one of the biggest things that we can do is start drawing down our silos a little bit, right? So the plant people need to have a little bit more conversation with the education people or the snowpack people, or and vice versa. I mean, they really, it's almost like you have to be a Jill or a Jack of all trades these days. You can't really stay in your lane, because if you do that, you're doing a disservice, and people start to lose that human dimension piece where they're not really seeing how it's all connected. It's all interconnected. So that would be, I think, the biggest challenge for us in our age group, and what we would need to do to kind of deal with all of these massive issues at one time, but easier said than done, right?
Yeah, climate change is definitely one of those issues that spans everything. All biology, all conservation, all management issues have to deal with climate change. And yeah, if I'm interested in plant biodiversity conservation, but I feel like I need to have a good grasp on climate science and things like that, if I'm going to be able to incorporate these considerations into my research, which maybe past plant biodiversity scientists did not have to do to the same degree as we do.
I think that jack of all trades thing really speaks to me. I've been thinking about that a lot, like how many things I do in my day that aren't just science, because I want my science to have an impact as much as possible. And it really does require a lot of extra work, whether that's writing, to your newspaper, or writing popular science articles, or, reaching out to managers, whatever it may be. There's all these set of communication skills, plus the diversity of different sciences that you probably need to incorporate, specifically climate science and beyond. And it can feel really taxing sometimes to like be good at all, or at least like reasonably good at all of these things. But it is a really necessary, I think, evil, I guess, for us in this generation of science to really need to be able to do all of those things. And it's really fun sometimes too, right? But it's also hard to kind of specialize and just be really good at one thing anymore.
I have a feeling that it may well be that contract work is going to become more and more important as the years roll on, both from a funding management point of view and also because it responds more rapidly to changing scenarios. And so small suggestion is, if you can get some experience of doing even small scale contract work at this stage and build up on that, that might be useful material to have behind you and have in your portfolio.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you so much. That's really useful. I'm going to try to do that.
Yeah, I was surprised. This summer was my first experience with land management and National Park Service and things like that. And I was surprised by the amount of contracting that goes on in things like botany and surveying and things like that. I had no idea. And it's something that my undergraduate education certainly did not prepare me for the level of contracting that goes on nowadays, or how to get into that or anything. We'll see how my graduate studies, if it includes anything on that. But yeah, I think that's a good point. And I've definitely come to realize this past summer how important it is.
Yeah, so Vida, you kind of touched on another point I think we were going to bring up today really quick, maybe one of our last points, is just, do you think that in this modern diverse world of conservation and management, as scientists, we're receiving the diversity of training that we really need coming out into the world in the academic institution? Don't be shy, be honest.
I will say that I think I have learned as much, if not more, from internships than from my undergraduate education. And that's nothing against the school I went to or anything, but I just think that there's nothing like, it's a cliche, there's nothing like experience, and things like really essential skills like data management and coding in R. I think that specifically project-based learning for things like that is just completely invaluable, as opposed to a classroom setting, just from my experience.
Well, this has been an education conundrum, I think, for quite some time, especially for ecology teachers and botany teachers and theology teachers, of how much teaching minutes do they actually get to do with the students, and how often do they get to expose them to the things that are absolutely necessary for them to be prepared for today's problems. And, you know, I think it was Janet in the chat was already talking about kind of the institutions need to change. There needs to be some redirection at a higher level than the faculty members themselves in order for our students to genuinely be prepared to face these problems. So it is going to require a little pushback from all sides in order to get that change to occur. I will say that there's something that ESA is actively trying to do with the ecology education community, the 4-dimensional ecology education framework, or 4DEE, which is really just asking educators to start thinking about teaching multidimensionally. And as the professional society of ecology, we're trying to endorse this framework so that, you know, faculty members can prop themselves up on the basis of meeting these core ecological concepts, field work, data analysis, all of that, cross-cutting themes, interconnection between human and environment and interactions, that they actually need to occur, you know, in our classrooms. Otherwise, our students are really just not going to be leaving with the needs of the challenges that they're facing. So I can't say that I would blame you, Vida, for feeling that way. I don't think that I felt that way when I left grad school even. You know, it is a big challenge that it's not going to just take an institution to figure it out. It's going to take all of us to figure it out. But yeah, and I'll stop there because I know we're getting ready to wrap up.
Yeah, with our last few minutes, does anyone have any final comments, ideas? I know in response to this discussion we've just had, I am very grateful for evolving technology. And I think more than ever, even here during the COVID pandemic, it's been really cool to see all the ways we've evolved to share ideas and concepts and make connections like never before. And I think, as other people have said, that really is instrumental too to my education as a student. And I think as our development as professionals, as scientists, is this really easy ability we have to communicate ideas and to make connections with people all over the world.
It's a very tiny point, but the area I was working on had quite complex vegetational structure, and a friend did a drone flyover, and I had always fought shy of trying to describe the vegetation pattern because it was so complex, but you get a pretty good feel for what it's like just from those drone images. And of course, you were mentioning education. It's quite a good educational tool as well, because you can convey what the area is like visually, which is one of the most efficient ways of communicating information.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. I've just seen such a plethora of like workshops and class. I mean, so many wonderful things that I'd love to go to, and I get to go to some of them, right, and save the rest for later. But you know, yeah, I mean, things using footage from the field or just having roundtable discussions like this, I think really are education in itself. And I've found a lot of value in those experiences, and that's really taught me how to kind of work at the interface between science and management more than anything, besides my internship experiences. But I think working groups and get-togethers of individuals from different boundaries that all have to do with plant biodiversity are a really good way to do that. And I think that's sort of the future of how we're going to possibly tackle all of these complex issues that not one single person can possibly do alone. Yeah, and Janet had also said, not sure academic researchers and educators can do everything all at once. Agreed. Which is why I've been thinking more about the importance of boundary organizations. And there are some great references posted here. There's also some YouTube links and TED Talks about science communication, lots of valuable tools in the chat.
All right, well, it looks like we're about at time. I want to thank everyone who's joined the chat today. I want to especially thank my guest hosts, Sienna, Hannah, and Vida, who are all extremely talented students, believe it or not. It's even hard to wrap my head around it sometimes when I hear them talk, but you all are doing fantastic work already. Keep doing what you're doing, and the future is bright, I shall say, with you at the helm. So thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us today. And I bid you adieu. I hope everyone has a lovely, wonderful weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.